Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Grand Slam Journey podcast, where I, together with my guests, discuss various topics related to finding purpose, maximizing our potential, sports, life after sports, and transitioning from one chapter of our lives to the next. If you enjoyed this episode, I want to ask you to please do two things. One, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform that you use to listen to this episode. Two, please share this episode with someone you believe may enjoy it as well. My today's conversation is with Sandy Farquharson. Sandy is a world-renowned expert in Padel. He is the founder of the Padel School and the host of the Padel School podcast. He is also a former collegiate and ATP Tour tennis player who coached players on both ATP and WTA tours. Most of Sandy's life was about tennis until he came across Padel in what seemed to me a very serendipitous occurrence. He stumbled upon Padel when a player dropped out from a tournament, and they desperately needed a willing replacement. After that tournament, which Sandy and his partner won, he never looked back and started his education in Padel. Sandy's mission is to help grow the game of Padel worldwide. He believes everyone should have access to practical advice they can understand and bring into their game. Whether learning a new sport, training to compete, or wanting to coach Padel, he is helping people reach the next level. He aims to bring together an active, supportive community that can help all players develop their Padel skills. During this conversation, Sandy and I cover many topics. We start with Sandy's athletic background, his experience of having a tiring childhood with many different sports, and the reasons he chose to focus on tennis. We talk about Sandy's college selection and collegiate tennis journey, including some of the challenges he faced. We briefly cover his attempt to continue playing on the ATP Tour while gaining his education as a Master of Sports Science with a focus on human performance. We discuss some aspects of what it takes to be a great tennis player and some differences between the men's and women's tour, including mindset and the support that a coach needs to provide. And last but not least, we talk about Padel. Why Sandy enjoys it, including some tips on transitioning from tennis to Padel, and why he believes it is a great sport that is rapidly expanding and will continue to grow at a fast speed. After re-listening to this conversation, I find Sandy's journey to date a pure demonstration of the famous Steve Jobs quote. You can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backward. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in the future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. This approach has never let me down, and it has made all the difference in my life. End quote. I want to invite you to pay attention to all the individual skills and experiences Sandy mentioned during our conversation. From creating tennis videos early on when he was coaching tennis, which is one of the essential skills for Sandy's current business, to understanding movement and human performance, and obviously the mindset. Sandy talks about the mindset he learned through tennis journey, as well as understanding and adjusting the support that a coach needs to provide, which is different for each player. One of my favorite quotes from this podcast: "The mindset you get from playing tennis, I don't think you can compare. It helps with business, and that ability to be able to play a point and immediately reset is so valuable. That's one of my most valuable skills. Taking that from tennis into the world of business and whatever, personal life, everything, to be able to reset when things don't go your way and not let yourself be emotionally bothered by that is such a key skill." Last but not least, please see the episode notes for links and resources on where to find Sandy. And now, enjoy the listen. Thank you for your time and welcome to the Grand Slam Journey podcast. It has been a while. I want to say probably more than 15 years since we connected.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here, Sandy.
A pleasure to be here with you, Clara. And it has been 15 years. It feels a lifetime ago.
Yeah, and I have no better guest than you to discuss tennis and Padel, as Padel has been something I've been considering recently. I was like, who can I talk to Padel about? And I have a perfect expert. I realized I watched some of your videos, and so I look forward to diving into tennis and Padel with you. But before we do, please introduce yourself, Sandy.
My name is Sandy Farquharson. I went to college at UTA with yourself on a tennis scholarship in the States. I'm from London in the UK. And, really until about 10 years ago, my background was tennis. After college, I played a couple of years on the tour. I coached on the WTA and ATP tour for a few more years after that while studying my master's in London. And really, I made the move to Dubai with tennis about 11 years ago. There was a role as a tennis coach for an academy there, and I thought it'd be a nice change. I spent so many years traveling on the tour, both playing and coaching, that it really just became enough travel, and I wanted to have a base. And I thought, let's go somewhere new, somewhere I hadn't been before. And a job role came up in Dubai, so that's where I went really. And I started the tennis over there, and quickly found out that the way tennis is set up in the UAE is not really what I was kind of hoping for. It's very expat dominated, less based on performance. And so quite quickly, I realized this was not for me. And after the first year there, I quit my tennis job and I was going to go back to Europe. And that's really when I stumbled upon Padel. And it was sheer coincidence getting into the Padel in the first place. My background before tennis was I played a lot of squash, and Padel is really a combination of tennis and squash. And so the week before I was leaving Dubai, there was a tournament, and I thought someone dropped out of the tournament and they said, look, can I fill in? And I thought, yeah, why not? It's a racket sport. Like, how hard can it be? And fortunately at the time, there were not a lot of players in Dubai, and myself and my partner did well in the tournament. We ended up winning the tournament. He was a good Spanish player. I was relying heavily on him. And at the end of the tournament, I was literally flying from the country an hour or 2 hours after the tournament. So I had my suitcases all on the side of the court, and I immediately left for the final to the airport. And on the way to the airport, the facility that was running this tournament gave me a call and said, look, would you be interested in being our rackets manager? And I said, my life is tennis. I've been in tennis for however many 20 odd years, and you've got no tennis courts because they only had paddle and squash and table tennis and badminton, but no tennis. And so I basically said, look, if you're willing to send me to Spain to get educated, to learn how to coach, to do all the coach education, become a player, etc., then I'll take on that job. And that's what they agreed to. Really, after that, I haven't looked back. I've been fully committed to Padel, and that was about 10 years ago.
Wow, what a fantastic transition. And I definitely want to dive into Padel more. But before we do, funny enough, not until I started doing the podcasts, I didn't realize how many friends I have international. So every podcast I do, I realize that I meet friends from a different country, and that somehow we ended up doing the same sport. So I want to go back in time, and even you, if you could describe, how's your upbringing in London, UK? Obviously, tennis is quite big sport there, but how did you choose tennis? I know you mentioned you played squash, so what was kind of the decision between the two? And is there somebody who influenced you more into tennis as you progressed?
Yeah, both my parents are squash players, or were predominantly squash players. So neither played a lot of tennis, but they had good hand-eye and they played a lot of squash. And as a child growing up, just south of London, I played every sport I could. I played rugby, football, cricket. Tennis was one of several sports that I was playing. I did a lot of swimming, and I really enjoyed that. I had a very tiring childhood at a younger age, and really I continued to do all those sports really until the end of my primary school, which was about 13 years old. And when it came to 13, it was a question of which school do I want to go to? And there are a number of sports schools around the UK, and tennis was probably the sport that I was best at on a national scale. At the time, I always finished within the quarterfinals of the nationals, so I was always top 8. And so I basically decided to get a tennis scholarship to a boarding school at Repton School up in Derby, and it was 2.5 hours away from family. And And that was really the time that I, quote unquote, specialized in tennis. And that's when it became the main sport for me. And I spent 5 years competing for Repton School within tennis, and I stopped all of the other sports. And then again, the decision came just before I finished to say, right, what am I doing next? Am I going to go to university in the UK, or do I look for college in the States? And in the end, I ended up making the decision to Texas Arlington. It was a difficult decision at that point because looking back on it now, I don't know whether my personality necessarily suited tennis, but it was the sport I was best at. And that decision that I made when I was, well, myself and my parents made at 12 years old, kind of put me in this line down for tennis that it was difficult to change. At school, once I got that tennis scholarship, it's not like I could change out of that to a different sport and maintain my scholarship. So I was really kind of committed to tennis from that age, really.
Interesting. I want to dive into, you mentioned you don't believe it's a sport that matched your personality or mentality best at. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so my youngest brother, he was a tennis player, and actually he just stopped maybe a year and a half ago, around 380 ATP, like very good player. And we are both completely different personalities. Like he is very happy being on his own. He's very single-minded. The life of a tennis player suited him well, that he preferred individual sports. When he played team sports, he felt like, he would never say this, but he felt like the team would let him down. Whereas for me, I think my most enjoyable time as a tennis player was in college when we played doubles and we were part of a team. The side of tennis that a lot of people don't really see is the loneliness. After college, to go and play on the tour is really, really lonely because the majority of tour players cannot afford an entourage to come with them. Yes. And unless they're supported by a federation, you're traveling on your own to airport, hotel courts for many weeks of the year. And so for me, I just found that really difficult because I'm much more of a team sports player, and college really showed me that. And it's also part of the reason why I enjoy padel more than tennis. But yeah, we can get to that.
That's interesting. Thank you for describing that. And for a number of podcasts, I've been thinking about, the team sports. I have guests who played more of a team sport versus individual and the differences. But I 100% resonate with the loneliness in tennis that many people don't realize just what it takes to travel. And it's always hard to find friends. I know Irina and I talked about it a little bit on our previous podcast and just how lonely it gets on the tour because it's hard to develop true friendship. You're somewhat competing against each other. There's some camaraderie, but it can be very difficult. And so why UT Arlington? How did you pick Texas out of all schools?
Good question. Really, if I'm honest, really honest, it's lack of preparation. I only decided at the last minute to go to university in the States, and David Corey, who was a senior when I went in as a freshman, was at UT Arlington. And really, it was last minute. We only spoke to a small handful of colleges. They gave us a good scholarship. David spoke highly of the setup and the team, and it was something I decided literally a couple of months before going. And it's interesting because the coach the first year was probably not my style of coach, and that first year I found tough, not only injuries, but also the kind of mindset towards the team. And then the coach changed in my second year to Diego Benitez, who obviously, and his personality and his kind of warmth on and off court kept me there. So in my second year, I started playing better and better. And as the time went on, I had obviously opportunities to go to other colleges and better ranked colleges. But I stayed for him and also for the team. Like you said, the camaraderie and the inclusion of the team. And again, going back to a team sport, it's something that the team meant more to me than my individual success within the rankings. And so that was kind of why I chose it and why I stayed.
Looking back, and I hate this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Would you have done something different when it comes to selection or would you have transferred knowing what you know now? I always find it's unfair. Like if you're in the moment, I strongly believe most of the time we make the right decision knowing the information that we have. But looking back, is there something you would have changed knowing what you know now?
I mean, that's like you say, it's a difficult question to answer that, because the path you choose is what's led you to where you are. And I don't regret any of it for a minute. But looking back on it, I would even go back even further that and say, would I choose tennis? And I've now got, my daughter is 2 years old, and it's going to be in a few years' time, which sports would I put her in? And would I recommend tennis as a sport? And I think that purely really goes down to the personality. But when it comes to the selection of the colleges, I think I would have probably done a bit more homework. I probably would have seen what the different options are out there. And if I'm honest, I think that had I chosen a college that was in a different geographical location and in a location that I probably enjoyed a bit more, I could have seen myself staying in the US after college. But because it was in Texas, Arlington, I felt at the end of the 4 years that I was like, that is enough for me. And so I left the US. But I think looking back, I'd have probably, done a bit more research, done a bit more homework on the colleges, the locations, a bit more about the different campuses, everything like that. And who knows, I may have still made that choice for UTA, but at least I would have had a more informed decision probably.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so curious, we overlapped only for about, I want to say 6 months or 1 year max. I believe I was starting when you had your last season. And I had a very shaky start. Just getting adjusted to everything was a challenge.
Everyone does, yeah.
Yeah, first 6 months. But I've always felt you had this drive, focus, sincerity. You were very professional. I know you were ranked, especially in doubles. You played fantastic doubles. So I remember one tournament, maybe it was still Midland, Texas, where you played very well. How was your college experience looking back? Some of the wins you have had or you would have placed sort of the highest?
I think it's glad you only met me in the last year, because that's probably when I was more professional. At the first year, I played with injury, really. I didn't play a lot in the first year, and that led to frustration, and that led to probably not being as professional as I could have / should have been. And I look back at it and think really the first 2 years, I didn't waste them because it was an experience, but had I approached it with a bit more professionalism, I would have probably started where I actually started as a junior instead of as a freshman. And it's difficult. It is a really difficult transition, because you arrive over there, you spend the first 4 to 5 weeks doing 6 a.m. stadium runs and doing this type of training you're not physically used to, and you're young, really. Like, I look back at it now and I think when you're 18 and you arrive, you're young. And you're also juggling a completely different way of studying in school. I'm sure for you, and it was the same for me. I was doing like political science of Texas in my first year and speech class. And, the Americans, I believe, are used to standing up and speaking in front of lots of people. I had a speech class where I would stand up and have to speak in front of 60 or 70 people in my class. And it terrified me, and so there was a lot of adjusting in that first year that affected on-court performance. And it's quite easy to look back and say, I wish I'd have been more professional, but there was just a lot going on, really. And then I started to get into the tournaments, into the game. And like I said, with the change of the coach and I got more into training and became more and more professional as it went on. And yes, I mean, one of the things with UT Arlington is it's quite difficult to become ranked. We played 5 or 6 highly ranked schools. And my last year, for example, I had a win over Baylor and beat someone in the time. He was like top 15. But then I have 1 or 2 losses to an unranked player, and we play 80% of the year against unranked players and teams. It's difficult to maintain that ranking. And so I was happy. I think in singles, I ranked between like 50 and 60, I think, at one point during the year. And then one loss just wiped that off. And then the doubles I enjoyed, and we got ranked. I think there was a stage where we were around top 10 or around 10 or 11 or something like that, which was great. But I look at it fondly. I had what I thought was some very good wins. And when you're playing number one at a college, like at which I did for the last 2 years at UTA, all it takes is one or two losses, that you have one or two off days and you don't get ranked. And that's where the selection of schools is different. The guy from Baylor, he lost to me.
Yes.
And I was probably his only loss against an unranked. I was probably the only person he played in his season that wasn't ranked, And so it's a difficult system, but there's no complaints. I look back on it and I thoroughly enjoyed the team side of it as well as the individual side.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you described it perfectly. I think they changed conferences now, so the situation might be slightly different now than when we played there. But I know the lineup of the schools and who we play against was always interesting. Yeah, I wish, especially the Southland Conference back then, I wish it was a bit more competitive overall when it comes to the ranking. And so going towards your graduation, and you mentioned you're deciding to move back to London, seemed like it was a straightforward decision. You didn't want to stay in Texas, but then you ended up going for a Master's of Sports Science, studying human performance, where you sort of said, this is what I'm doing next. How did you know you were interested in it?
When I finished college, I, like most, did not know what I wanted to do. And so studying a master's was in some ways delaying that. And I felt like I'm going to use those 2 years to compete, to play some tournaments, just to see what the tour is like, to get an experience for that. But I was probably already coming to the conclusion that I wasn't playing to a level that I could compete at the top. And so then it would be like, what would I want to do career-wise? And I wanted it to be in the arena of sport, as it were. And so the biomechanics of human performance seemed like a good step for me. I also did my strength and conditioning qualifications and sports massage. So, I thought for me, it might be an all-encompassing role as a coach for a tennis player. And for me, I really felt like a coach for a top-level tennis player should be able to do sports massage. They should understand strength and conditioning, because those areas are really key. Yes. I don't believe it's good enough to just know on-court technique and tactics. And so that's kind of why I studied that and where I went after that. But it was also partially because I was still not sure of what I wanted to do. And I was buying myself a bit more time to make that decision.
But it seemed like you had inside a mindset of, this is what I'm interested in. So you know where your passion is. And did you see it really combining your skills and experience with tennis? Like what you mentioned now, kind of the reasoning that tennis coach, which I highly agree with, especially nowadays, tennis being so physical. I think you need to understand the movement. You need to understand different muscles and how they connect because of so many injuries. So being able to do some massage or relaxation when you're traveling with a player, I think that's just a huge plus and a key. I don't still know how many coaches now can do that for their player. But the way you described it now, it seemed like it was quite good reasoning. So were you subconsciously going that path, thinking you're going to then become a coach and travel with players? Because that's eventually what you went to do afterwards. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think if I look back at it, look back now with knowing what I do now, I think that already then I was starting to try and find a way of working for myself. And, if I look back at the things I was doing off court, it leads to, and I'm not a fan of using the word entrepreneur, but it leads to working for myself and having my own direction. And I think at the time, I thought that would be an all-encompassing role for a player. Now, when I started that role, and that's how I started, I moved to the south of France and I started with a female player who at the time, I think when I started, she was around 1,000 in the world. And then we worked with each other until she got to about 190 or 180 or something like that. And I provided that role. And for me, it was really interesting because another area of tennis that people don't realize is the amount of time that you have to yourself when you're on tour. Because everyone looks at Wimbledon and they see, they're watching the highlight reels. But really, when you travel, you play a practice or you play a match, and that's 2 hours out of your day playing that match. And then you're unlikely to have another practice because you want to be rested, and but you may do a little bit of stuff on court. You might need a bit of sports massage, but you've then got another 5 or 6 hours of your day that is like, what do I do with this? And at that time, I started developing tennis tutorials online. And this is like right before YouTube or right at the beginning of YouTube. I remember making these tutorials, essentially what I'm doing now for paddle, but with tennis, and someone saying, why don't you put them on YouTube? And at the time I was like, why on earth would I do that? Like, YouTube is for people dancing, a bit like people said at TikTok at the beginning and all of these, And so at the time it was a very different kind of system. But what I'm kind of getting at is that even though I was going down that path of trying to be that role for a player, I was just really trying to work out for myself what I wanted to do and how I was going to do it. And I still think I was young at that point. I was probably 24 or 25, but still I felt like I didn't know what I wanted to do. And it took a few years to kind of narrow it down.
Yeah, thank you. And what an amazing achievement, bringing player from 1,000 to 190 or under 200. That's, fantastic.
She was a very talented player. So I was fortunate.
Yeah, and it always takes two. I think the pairing of a coach and a player, same thing as what you described in college. I actually think it's equally important. Just to share, like looking back, I would actually encourage players to not only really do a good research about school, but do good research about the coach and the style of coaching when you're really looking to be active player on a team, and just the way the style fits, because I think that ultimately really drives development. Now, there's unpredictable things that happen. Coaches leave, players can leave, and it can be hard to assess that. But I think it's equally important in college as it is on the tour, and obviously the tour even more so perhaps, but you have a little bit more flexibility maybe to change on a tour, because if you try 1 or 2 seasons and it doesn't work out, you're not bound to the 4-year contract this much. I know there's transfers may happen, but then they can be quite complex once you get to school.
I would add to that, Clara, actually. Interesting you say that, because I would also add to that, not only the coaching style of the coach, but also like their objective and their recruitment.
Yes.
Like, why are they recruiting who they're recruiting? And is it a process? Because they're essentially recruiting your team, your teammates. So, and I know lots of colleges that they would, if someone had poor results, they would cut them from the program. And that, I think, is so important, that they have a mindset of development, because you are there for 4 years and it is a commitment. And so if you get there in the first year and you're already written off halfway through your first year, then they're not developing the way that you could be. And I think that is something else I would have looked at had I been doing it again.
Yeah, thank you for that addition. I 100% agree. Now, what made me realize, I guess, me coming from the corporate America, there should be some interviews where you can actually have calls and meetings, not just with the coaches, but with the players, and interview, the top 3 players or 3 and like a bottom one to see what their experience is like from different backgrounds. Because I do agree the team makes a big difference, and just the mentality of the team. The team is typically structured around few players too that end up graduating at some point, but there's, I would say, a core within the team, and obviously that's enabled and amplified by the coach. But going back to your personal coaching experience, how did you find the player? Because that can be also quite challenging, like finding that match, and maybe even more so on the tour, because it's really just the two of you traveling. I think creating this safe space to where you click on the court and you can improve the skills while practicing, but also off the court, as you mentioned, because you have so much time, outside. So you can't have a player and a coach that get on each other's nerves, but more of like knowing how you can relax the player and have fun together when, they're not competing. I think that is very rare. And I think if you find it, that's when that relationship and performance can really fuel the ranking and the success on the court. Was there something specific if you look back?
I think it's a really interesting topic because even if I look at the men's tour versus the women's tour, I think the type of role that the coach plays differs, and you talk about camaraderie. And I feel like that's what the male coach is in the men's tour is very much that. And I feel like the women's tour is slightly different in that, I started that as I was a very good hitting partner for any female player. And so already you're ticking a box there because it's more difficult for female, and this is not sexist at all, but I'm just saying it's more difficult for females to find hitting partners at a tournament than it is for men. It's more difficult to go and start those conversations on the ladies' side of things. And for me, I felt like it was emotionally more supportive for the ladies' tour. And that's what I would say I'm good at. I'm calm. I'm keep under control. I'm that support role. And so it felt like a good move to start in the ladies' tour because of the level I played. And I knew that my personality type would help a female player kind of keep calm during tournaments and feel like they've got a bit more grounding, because there were some tournaments that we would go to and you walk into the player lounge and it felt really hostile, so to have someone with you that is, has got your back, I feel like a big thing particularly for the ladies' game. The men, I think, is slightly different in that they're a bit more comfortable kind of making friends in groups and it's less, help me here, Clara, but it's less, do you know what I mean? It's less emotionally based and more, there's a bit more camaraderie, I feel like, with the men.
Yeah, I love that you're actually describing it. And obviously, you've seen both sides. I have never coached men. I had a boyfriend who still plays, so I traveled with him a little bit. But I've seen that side. I think you guys take things a little bit more lightly. That's what I'm wondering, within women, whether sometimes the competitiveness we have within, and tennis by nature, it's very competitive sport and you're really just by yourself. And then if you have a great doubles players, maybe there's two of you, but in singles, you're still competing against each other. So that's very hard. But I do agree. And actually now, as you mention it, I wonder if that also carries over to a little bit of the business and corporate world that I'm in. And I've been contemplating about that mindset for quite a while and just the differences between men and women in the workplace. And I totally see some commonalities that actually you helped me understand, explaining the tennis tour perspective. And yeah, I 100% agree. I've traveled, by myself for a while. I'm trying to think how I found my hitting partners. I think I always just had one or two that I sort of had. I traveled with a coach. And so by nature, we just practiced together.
That was the easiest thing to do that.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's really interesting. And just as a generalization, the female players are, in my opinion, incredibly capable, probably to some extent more capable than the male counterpart, let's say. And I'm talking not at the top level. I'm talking, futures, challengers, when they're traveling for the tour. But it was the confidence that I feel like the female players lacked. And it's almost like the male players had more confidence than their capabilities for a lot of the time, whereas it was almost the other way around for the females. And, I know a big part of the player that I traveled with, it was incredibly talented, but just could not see it herself. And it was building that confidence up and just making sure that confidence wasn't chipped away by walking into a player lounge full of hostile stares, and things like that. And so that's almost the way I would kind of see it, was that I was there as a support for confidence. Yes, what I said as a coach was important too, but really it was to be that kind of solid support partner that they needed. And to be a hitter as well was almost a bonus, because that meant they didn't have to have the stress or put themselves in a situation where they had to find a partner, which is stressful.
Wow. I love that we're getting into this, because it's really very mental, and the difference between the psyche and how we prepare for a sport. I'm going to bash the women's tennis players, I think, across the board here. But one of my jokes have been never bet on women's tennis because you never know how we wake up. Like, I think there's a bit more volatility when it comes to surprise wins or losses in the women's sport. And maybe it's due to, I might be more aware of it. I don't have the statistics, it's just the examples that come to mind. And when you look at even the big Grand Slams, there's typically more surprises that you might be able to see in the women's side of the sport than the men's side of the sport. And so I feel the mental aspect of tennis, obviously it's very important on both sides, but I agree with the confidence of like men, and this is even in my corporate world, I feel men come across just way more confident, and women, something I've been contemplating about forever. I've attended many women leadership courses and programs, and every single time imposter syndrome is one of those topics. And I keep thinking about, can we just get over this? Like, why is it part of that topic? And it seems like now that, you talking about it, it carries over probably to everything, even to tennis.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're making the comment about women's tennis and really they're at the pinnacle of the game. But if you think about it, it was the same in college.
Yeah.
And actually now I think having a daughter has kind of opened my eyes, because now I'm already looking at what coaching is like for junior girls.
Mm-hmm.
And not just in tennis, but in football and in sport in general. And I think that that's where the problem is the coaching, like the level of coaching and the understanding of how to be that support role as a coach. And yes, it's not just about treating a girl as a girl. It's nothing to do with that. It's treating a player as an individual.
Yeah.
I just feel like the system for female players, because there was a time when I was doing the training for the under 18 females with the GB guys, I was shadowing Carl Meiss, an excellent coach from Belgium. And it was the same. It was almost at a point that if I look back at it now and I think about the female college players we had who were fantastic, again, super talented, same as the ones on the tour, I think by that stage, they'd already got this lack of confidence and lack of self-esteem. And, and I don't think it's just in tennis. It is in business. It's in everywhere. And I just think, is the support right in the younger years for girls and maybe not just girls, for boys as well. But I look back at the tennis now and it's funny because I haven't talked about tennis for years. So it may have changed, but I do remember looking back and even now when I see female coaching on a court, like coaching young girls, I just think this is not, for me, it's not really the right approach to working with girls at a young age. And if you shatter that confidence at that age, then how are they going to rebuild it through a childhood of pressures?
Wow. I love that. Maybe we can do a whole separate podcast on just that, Sandy, or when you come up with some tools. I'm totally up for it. Actually, funny thing, I'm reading this book, Power for All, and it's a lot about examples of power. And I did just a short recording of what it means, but that really comes down to, in order to have power, there's really two biological things. Safety, the fact that we're safe, our basic primal human brain looks for safety by nature, and that's why trust is so important. And creating trust and esteem, like the fact that we're worthy of our own self-esteem and how you create that esteem. And so if you don't have those two basics, you can't really have as much power, which then drives influence. And really, I think that esteem, my next level of research will be going to like self-esteem and confidence. And there's differences in those two, but it's quite interesting. Maybe just for the sake of time, because I could be talking to you for a couple of hours here, I wonder if that's a good segue to Padel. You mentioned you went from tour, then you moved to Dubai. You are still doing tennis in Dubai, and then you mentioned you found Padel through almost serendipitous occurrence.
Yeah, and I didn't mention in the initial story, but the person whose tournament it was that I then became rackets manager was the Crown Prince of Dubai. So he's the next in line to be ruler. And that put me in a place where I was involved in setting up the Padel Federation in the UAE. I was the tournament organizer for the World Padel Tour in Dubai. It was a great position to be in to really experience the top end of the sport. It's interesting talking about tennis again, because I look back on it and we're talking now about self-esteem and being part of a team. And one of the reasons that I was getting frustrated with tennis in Dubai is that it is incredibly difficult to teach an adult beginner tennis and them enjoy it. Technically, it's such a difficult game that if you don't learn it as a child, it is very difficult. You need lessons. I mean, I'm sure you've coached adult beginners, and it takes a long time for them to be at a level, a number of lessons to be at a level to play the game and enjoy it. I mean, just the serve alone is however many lessons.
100%. Yeah.
When I came to Padel, there I had complete adult beginners that had never played a racket sport, and within half an hour they're playing and they're implementing tactics. And I just felt like, oh, this is much more me. Like, it was sociable. It was a team game. It was accessible. I did a lot of coaching tennis with Down syndrome. Like I had a couple of kids that were Down syndrome, and I did, lessons with them every week and in tennis. And it was really eye-opening and incredibly kind of humbling, because their improvements, that both of us had worked so hard. And actually I look back at my time and I'm in a way more proud of their kind of improvement rather than taking someone from 1,000 to 200, because I just felt like that was, it really challenges your coaching to another level if you can do that. But then when we went into Padel, it was almost like these people, and I'm not referring now to Down syndrome, but people that are new to racket sports can pick up the game so quickly, and technically it's easier. I mean, it's for the same reason that pickleball is popular. Padel is popular because it is easy to play and easy to be sociable and have fun on a court.
Yeah. And that's a really great intro. It's just been such a rise of even pickleball. I've been doing a little bit of research, I have to admit, because there are so many of these, seems like new sports, the racket sports. I think we all know squash. That seems to be more popular in Europe. There's the racquetball in the US, tennis. I guess badminton is an old one. But now, as I've been researching, there is pickleball that has been on a huge rise in the US. There's, talks, LeBron James and Tom Brady investing in the sport, in the fastest growing sport in the US, then the Padel. There's also Padel, Paddle, and that is a little bit different than the Padel you play. And
I think part of the reason that Padel that I'm referring to is not bigger in the US is because of these sports. In the US, you have paddle tennis and you have platform tennis, you have pop tennis, you have pickleball, you have all of this in the US. But outside of the US, no one is playing platform tennis or pop tennis or really even pickleball. I mean, pickleball is starting now a little bit in the UK and, dotted around in a few other places, but it's not, I think it's something like 15,000 courts in the US, and it is the sport, like you say, LeBron James and they're sponsoring these teams, and, you see Jamie Foxx bringing out his own pickleball racket. And I think that this is part of the reason why entry into the US market for Padel has been a bit slower, but around the rest of the world, it is essentially what is happening with pickleball in the US is happening with Padel for everyone else.
Yeah, because you guys even have now, or guys, there's a world championship. You participated and represented UK. Was that in Dubai in November?
Yeah. They've been going on for the last 30 years. So I've played for Great Britain for the last 10 or so. A couple of years after starting in Dubai, part of my training was to get my level as high as possible. And then I started representing Great Britain. And the last one was in Dubai. And, that was a couple of months ago. And now there's more and more countries playing. And it's really interesting to watch that evolution, because 10 years ago, there were only a small handful. And really the level was, kind of hit and miss, let's say that. But now, there are countries all around the world that are playing really, really good level. Loads of tennis players being converted to the game, and, it's getting more and more competitive.
Yeah. So maybe let's just go back and describe a little bit of Padel. And maybe before we do that, I do agree all of what you mentioned is social game, more of a team spirited, seems like more accessible. Going back to US and the pickleball rise, one of the things here have been definitely those three, but also it's easier, what you mentioned, easier to pick up, and economies of scale. Because especially in pickleball, I believe in the US, you can actually have more courts. So one tennis court can have, I believe, 2 pickleball courts. So you can actually put more people into like a smaller area. So when people think about starting clubs, I guess the revenue on that investment can be a little bit more because of just that size. But going to Padel, imagine Padel 101, Sandy. How would you describe it to somebody who doesn't know Padel and why to play the game?
When we talk about economies of scale and just referring to pickleball there, the other thing with pickleball is it's so cheap to have the equipment to put up the court. You essentially need a net, which is $20-30, and draw lines on the court. And then you need a wiffle ball and a couple of rackets, right? The difficulty with Padel is that the court is a mixture of glass and metal fence. It's 20 meters by 10. So each side is 10 meters by 10 meters. It's always played in doubles, but that court is a bit more expensive. You're probably talking 35 to 45,000 US dollars for a single court, more depending on, where you're buying it, etc., if you're getting it shipped. And it's the same reason pickleball is popular. It's easy to play. It's sociable because it's always doubles. Tactics can be implemented quite quickly. The reason I like Padel more than pickleball, for me personally, is that I find that the tactical elements of Padel continue to be challenging throughout your level. So you've got the glass behind you. And so when the ball goes into the wall behind you, you can play the ball off 1 glass or 2 glasses and you're turning, and it all becomes part of the strategy. So when you're learning Padel for the first time, it's very much beginner and maybe use the glass once or twice. But when you get to a higher level, it becomes really physical and the rallies can be 30, 40, 50 shots, and you are using the glass all the time. The lob is a big part of the game because the overheads are quite difficult to be able to play it and use the glass. The scoring is the same as tennis. So 15 love, 30 love, 40 love, etc., with sets, tie breaks, all of that. But the game is, for me, it's been interesting as a good level tennis player to come across to Padel, to find myself constantly challenged, both physically and tactically throughout. And I tore my ACL on my knee about 6-7 years ago. And after that point, like now, for example, the dynamic changing of direction on a tennis court, I would really, really struggle with, amongst other things, like we kind of talked about a bit before is, physically, tennis, to play the level that I played now, I'm physically incapable of doing that. Whereas Padel, it's much more about controlling the speed of the ball, understanding the strategy. Yes, there are power shots, but the vast majority of the game is about placement. And it's often described as being a bit like chess, in that you've got to move your opponents into difficult positions before you get an opening in order to be successful. And physically, with my knee and my age, I find it easier for me to play at a higher level in Padel.
Yeah, thank you for that. And selfishly, that's one of the key reasons I'm interviewing you, because I'm trying to figure out myself if and what sport I can transition to. I 100% resonate with just not being able to keep up physically with tennis as a game. Obviously, I don't play singles anymore. I've only played doubles this year, and that alone is just the half a court. It's still very challenging for me, and just the amount of effort that it takes to keep my body together from just one match is just becoming too much that it's not sustainable long term, because it prevents me from actually even working out. I have to plan like my whole day around it, like including prep. And I have to say, I've been doing homework and I signed up for your Padel videos. So you have website, thepedalschool.com, which I found fantastic. Great job, Sandy, on explaining it. Even me, who never seen Padel, could understand it. And that definitely one thing that stood out to me is, I guess, the complexity. I wonder if it came from squash, because as a tennis player, I'm always used to just seeing the ball in front. I've played racquetball in college once with a person who never really played racquetball, and I was just lost. Like, it bounced from all sides. You kind of locked me inside this court and I didn't know what to do with myself. I was running into the other player. Maybe that's a slightly different dynamic, but watching paddle, it reminds me that a little bit. And so that aspect of hitting from the side wall or the back wall, I'm assuming that adds a lot of complexity. And I would say, coming from tennis, that's probably some of the main differences that I have kind of
I think the difference with paddle is that you keep your side. So you focus on your side. So if you're playing on the left, generally speaking, it's not like tennis where you switch with your partner behind. And so, or squash, for example, like squash, you're covering the whole court on your own. And therefore it can get, or racquetball the same, a little bit like that. And so you're covering your side. And so you have the option. And as a tennis player, I'm sure at the beginning you will be doing this, where you are half volleying and volleying before the ball touches the glass, because you're like, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm just going to volley and avoid the glass. And everyone does that. I did that. It's quite natural at the beginning to do that. And you can almost allow the game, you can allow to introduce it as you feel comfortable, if that makes sense. So, the first time you play, I'm sure you're going to play a mini version of tennis. And then as you say, right, I'm going to use the glass a little bit more and just see what that like, you will gain a bit more confidence. And really, the more introduction of the glass you can get at the beginning, the better you will be, because that's something, if looking back on my paddle learning, I wish someone had forced me to use the glass at the beginning, because then I would have been that much better at it from the beginning, instead of being a typical tennis player and avoiding it. But it is definitely one of those sports that you will enjoy. Like, if you don't enjoy it the first time playing, you are probably the only person I've spoken to that that will feel like that, because it's very easy to enjoy, because you're hitting the ball. It's a nice sound off the racket, a bit unlike pickleball, which I find is a bit of a jarring noise, but you will immediately enjoy the game, and you'd start to hit lobs and play aggressively. And then you'll understand, hey, I can change my tactics, and it's about learning the game after that. And the more you play it, the more you realize it's different to tennis and any other racket sport. And then you've got to dedicate time to learning it. And that's where our content comes in.
Yeah, thank you. Because two things I did actually yesterday. After watching your video, I started looking where's the closest paddle club. So I'll let you know, they're supposed to be opening one now in January in the Bay Area. So I signed up for it to let me know when it does, to try it, because your videos definitely inspired me. And I guess the second thing, I had a realization watching your videos and how great you explain it and the technique. It does seem very different than tennis. I guess you get the benefit of the hand-eye coordination. You know how to hit a ball with the racket, although it's a smaller racket. It seems more of it is driving through the ball and maybe slicing. And maybe you can reuse a little bit of that movement, like knowing the perception of the ball and trajectory, where you stand. But other than that, the technique seemed quite different. It is.
Yeah, it is very different. And there's several things that tennis players have an advantage, and, basics like the split step and, distance from the ball and kind of firming the grip up on contact and that type of stuff that tennis players take for granted that they will do automatically. But it is a different sport. And one of the kind of disadvantages of it being a really easy sport to pick up is that you might play for years before getting your first lesson. And loads of people do. And they come to a coach and they say, hey, I want some lessons. They've already been playing for 3 or 4 years. And as a coach, then you are trying to change bad habits as opposed to teach them from scratch. Yeah. So we're always recommending, like, if possible, try and get some coaching from the start. And this is not as easy to do because the qualifications and the level of coach education at the moment in paddle is not that high, and if you take the US as an example, but it's the same with any country that paddle is developing, is that they are getting it's tennis coaches that are going and saying, oh, I'll coach you a bit of paddle, and it's, I've seen it played. Or you're getting good paddle players that have no coaching qualifications or education saying, I know how to play, I'll try and teach you. And therefore, the level of coaching is probably going to be what holds a lot of clubs and countries back, I think.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because I 100% remember from tennis, or I'm sure many of my listeners who play any sports can resonate with needing to relearn something when you start early. And one of the things I definitely have back from my childhood, just the pain I had to relearn my forehand. And it took me probably the whole winter, 6 months, and then another 6 months of trying to gain more confidence in it, and many more years after that, just overcoming that, trusting that different grip that I had to relearn. And so 100% relearning something is way harder than learning the right way from the start. Other than finding a great club and good coaches, I guess, how could one know that it's a good coach? Other than one thing that comes into mind is check your videos, whether that aligns with your instructions.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tough question in any sport, right? Or business. How do you know you found a good coach? And I think that a good coach in any sport is probably less about the sport, more about the communication, organization. How is the structure of their lesson? Is this a group or individual lesson? And I think when it comes to the actual content of what they're providing, I mean, that's kind of what we're trying to do with the Padel School is, and it's the reason that we put out a ridiculous amount of content, is to help people, players and coaches, know more about the technique. And I think if you can find someone that is going to help teach you and give you the tips that you need to become a better player, then that's probably the sign of a good coach, as opposed to what we often see is someone telling you all they know about the game and you then having to try and pick out one from the 100 pieces of advice you receive in a lesson, and the tips for you will be like most tennis players, it will be shorten your swing, make yourself more compact, hit softer. It's kind of following and remembering how you play tennis. It will probably be even more softer. Yes. But yeah, it will be along those lines.
Yeah, literally, it seems like you know me well. I'm a power hitter, although I think that's a lot of the Czech tennis. There's typically, when somebody does specific sport, I feel like most of the time from specific countries, there is a style of the game that is taught. So I relate to myself as like Czech. I've never seen a soft hitter. We all hit quite big. So I kind of relate to that a little bit, as well as my body structure. Because with 182 centimeters, I can't run on the court forever. So I need to build my game. Otherwise, I get tired of all the smaller girls that will run there forever and hit your balls back. So that kind of brings me to a few things. The softness and the skill and a little bit of the footwork. And we talked about Padel not being as physically demanding, but I'm assuming the footwork and where you stand and how you navigate the court. What are key differences there, Sandy?
I would say that Padel is a different type of physically demanding. At the pro level, the players are incredibly fit. They're playing three-hour matches, and the rallies are 50 shots long, and they are having 8 or 10 seconds between points. So at that level, it's incredible fitness, but you don't need obviously that level of fitness to play. And so kind of hitting softly, hitting with control. It's a game of consistency, really, a learning level. There are some nuances about Padel that tennis players, for example, there's 2 of you on a court and the width is 10 meters. So it really takes away the passing shot. To get past your opponent, you need to use the lob, for example. And this idea that they play a rally in Padel, and if the rally is 20 or 30 shots, there'll probably be 10 to 12 to 15 lobs in that rally. Whereas you think in tennis, I hit one lob like every 2 or 3 games, because that's how often people come to net. So there are a lot of changes, and this is kind of what's interesting. And what really kind of hooked me was I felt like I'd done tennis for so many years. And so to go into a new sport, to learn all these new techniques, these new tactics, and to continually find it challenging, even now, it's a game for thinkers as well as hitters.
Mm-hmm. So I wonder if it can lengthen the lifespan of a paddle player versus tennis player, right? Because tennis is such a demanding sport, and even more watching the tennis players now than even 15, 20 years ago when I still played. It seems like the rallies are longer and they're just keep hitting harder with the evolution, obviously, even of the rackets.
And the surfaces are unforgiving in tennis. The hard court surfaces are tough, and the clay is tough because the rallies are longer. I mean, grass is the only kind of forgiving surface, whereas, in padel, it's AstroTurf. So it's, artificial grass with a little bit of sand in there. But there are loads of players in their 40s that are playing at the top of the game. The world number one, who is essentially the Federer of paddle, is now 42 and he's still competing and he's top 10. And so if you keep yourself in good physical condition, you can definitely play the game longer. And I think as well, at a recreational level, you can play it to an older age and you spend less time wandering around the court, picking the balls up like in tennis.
Yeah. Maybe let's dive into some of the special shots. Watching your videos, I feel like some of the things are very different and called differently. Serve is actually very different, which I was like, I sort of like my serve, although it's probably the thing I shouldn't do, because after my serve, my shoulder just, I get a lot of shoulder pain. So maybe the underserve is actually the smarter thing for me to transition to. But also there's chiquita, bandeja. There's quite a few special shots. Do you have a favorite one? Or what are some of the differences you would recommend tennis players?
For me, taking the serve out of tennis, the serve is, I would say, to have a good serve is probably one of the most technically difficult things in any sport. To be able to do that well and effectively is so difficult. And I wonder how many recreational players try and learn the tennis serve and just give up. And they end up throwing it up and doing a frying pan kind of action and just to get the ball in because it's so technically difficult. So to remove that immediately makes the game more accessible to everyone. And, so at the beginning level, you serve underarm, and if you can hit fast with a bit of slice against the glass, your opponents find it difficult to play. But then as you improve in level, so do your opponent. And like at my level, for example, there's never an ace. There's never an ace, and there's maybe one or two return mistakes the whole match. And so every point is a rally. So immediately it makes it a little bit more accessible to people, but because it's easier to get going in the point, but it also makes it a bit more interesting to play. And, I every time I walk past tennis courts and I watch a couple playing tennis and at a recreational level, I see most of the time they're picking the ball up, and if they get a rally of 3, then it's like, that is a good day. So as a sport, generally, it lends itself to participation. And the name for the shot is it's from a Spanish descent, the bandeja, the chiquita, the vibra. These shots, they're kind of ways of hitting the ball, and really that kind of exciting thing for a tennis player. And other than getting to understand the rebound from the walls is then the overheads, because there are several different types of overhead in paddle, and there are overheads to maintain court position. You have defensive overheads, you have very offensive overheads, you have overheads that are different on one side to the other side, because like I said earlier, there's so many lobs in the point that you need to have the armory and the arsenal to deal with those with your overheads. And the majority of the overheads are hit at a relatively soft speed. Whereas in tennis, if you have an overhead, it's to finish the point, and you might have one, and maybe rarely you have 2 in a point. But here, it's 10, 12 overheads in that point. And a lot of it is controlling the positioning of your opponents and giving yourself better opportunities on the next shot. And it's only one in a while that is the power overhead.
Yeah, that again, it's really resonated with me. You lacking to hit my power shots. It seems like that's not likely what's going to help you succeed in paddle, but being strategic and knowing where to place it and where to hit it. So watching just some of your videos last night, it really seems more about the placement. And I guess with that, a lot of the technique that will allow you to have the accuracy and placement. Are there any of your favorite drills, Sandy, you would recommend starting with when somebody's about to pick up the sport?
The beauty of the sport is that you can pick it up and play games straight away. So I would say that would be my first advice and my advice to you would be to, when the courts are there, to go with 3 friends and play a game and have fun. And you will learn about the game as you play. And I feel like I was putting you off a little bit there, taking away your serve and taking away your power shots. But yeah, it would really be to go and enjoy yourself and to have a bit of fun on the court. And, what will happen, I'm sure, is you'll play once and then you'll be like, right, I'm already getting a bit hooked. When can we play again? And you go down. And I would say after a while, or, when you feel like you've played a few times and you want to learn more, then well, that's exactly what our videos are for, to learn more. But then you can look at doing some drills and understanding a bit more about the game.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sandy. Just being mindful of time here. We've dived into a lot of the questions I had on the list, but anything else you would want to share? Maybe the outlook on Padel overall. I think we talked about it, but I know you're really big in the community, always cheering and inspiring people to start the game and have more courts. Where do you foresee the sport heading, and anything else you would want to share with listeners?
Yeah, I think my advice would be to give it a go. And if in the US it's a little bit difficult, there are pockets of Padel, Houston, Miami, and you're now starting to see that there's a little club in Philadelphia or in Texas, different areas. And I was recently in LA where they were private courts and going and kind of training with some of those guys there. But I would say, look, the first would be to have a go, to try and give it a go, because around the world, outside the US, the game is growing. Like most of the European countries, it's growing about 300 or 400% year on year. It's, really shooting up. And so it will only be a matter of time until it comes to the US. I already know lots of people that are looking for projects in the US because they see that as a great market for it. And it doesn't have to be to the exclusion of tennis or pickleball or squash or racquetball. It's another racket sport, and it's another reason for people to stay active and to stay healthy. And I don't, so many people talk about pickleball being a competitor or tennis being the competitor, and you can't have both. But in my mind, if you have more people in racket sports, that can only be a good thing for everyone, really. So yeah, my advice would be to have a go at it. And, if you need any help along the way, then that's what we're here for with the Padel School and the content we put out. Yeah,
thank you. I went on your Instagram. I know you've shared a lot of knowledge there. You have your own website, thepadelschool.com. How else can people find you?
Yeah.
What's the best way to reach out or subscribe and learn about Padel?
We post lots and lots of content on Instagram. We have a YouTube channel, The Padel School. We're on TikTok. You can find me on LinkedIn. And the website is where we have our community. So that's where we'll have our member database and our in-depth courses. And we have live calls and lots of analysis on there. So, I'm generally pretty good. And I say that generally at responding. So yeah, please message on any of those.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I 100% agree. I saw just 5 videos and I think they got me excited and really thinking deep about Padel. So I encourage anyone to check out your content. I think it's beautifully made and a lot of great advice.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else you want to get out to the world, Sandy, or we should close out with?
I don't think so. I think it's been a great discussion, and thank you, Clara, for inviting me on the podcast. And I'm looking forward to continuing that and seeing you play for the Czech paddle team at some point.
It'd be fantastic. Funny enough, yesterday I was thinking, could I start Padel and still be highly competitive?
Definitely. I can tell you the answer to that now, Clara, and the answer is yes, definitely.
Yeah, thank you. One thing I have realized going back to tennis this year, which has been physically painful experience, is just that competitive mindset when you get on the court and just the pure. There's something pure when you're in that moment and playing some of the most important points of how you think about it and whether you make it or not. That I actually really miss. I almost forgot how it feels because I haven't played in so long. And so it'll be fantastic to get a little bit of that feeling back maybe with Padel. And
just on that note, I mean, I think the mindset, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I feel like I was more of a team sport player, but the mindset that you get from playing tennis, I don't think you can compare it. I'm sure golfers are probably similar, but I really do think that it helps with business, and that ability to be able to play a point and immediately reset is so valuable. Like, that's one of my most valuable skills, I think, taking that from tennis into the world of business and whatever, personal life, everything. Being able to reset when things don't go your way and not let yourself emotionally get bothered by that is such a key skill.
Yeah, thank you. I actually realized that I almost forgot it. And so going back on the court reminded me a great way to practice it and keep it in my corporate life or business life as well. So it kind of complements each other. And I hope I'll be able to visit my sister in London. She lives in London. So maybe next time I have a trip there, I would love to hire you for a few tips and lessons if I pick up the sport. And hopefully this Padel club opens up here in the Bay Area early next year so I can try it out. And I'll be probably bugging you for more advice on racket and watching your videos on how to get better.
Yeah, well, just remember me when you go on the ladies paddle tour.
Sounds good. That's a great aspiration to have. I don't know if I'll get that far, but I'm definitely curious and excited to give it a try. So I'll stay in touch and let you know how my Padel experience is progressing.
Perfect. I look forward to hearing about it.
Thank you so much, Sandy, for your time. It's great to reconnecting with you. And if you enjoyed this episode, I want to ask you to please do 2 things that would help me greatly. 1, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform that you use to listen to this episode. 2, please share this podcast with a friend who you believe might enjoy it as well. It is a great way to remind someone you care about them by sharing a conversation they might be interested in. Thank you for listening.